The dust had not even settled on the road when Robert Hudson planted his boots in the dirt between the gate and the three mounted men, and the words left his mouth like the crack of a whip splitting dry autumn air. "Dismount and walk away or stay and explain yourselves to me." His hand rested on the grip of his Colt single-action army revolver, not drawing, not threatening outright, but the message was carved into every line of his jaw and the hard set of his shoulders beneath that worn leather duster. The badge on his chest caught the late afternoon sun and threw a small, blinding flash across the faces of the three riders, and not one of them flinched, which told Robert everything he needed to know. These were not nervous drifters. These were men who had ridden here with a purpose, and that purpose had everything to do with the woman standing on the porch behind him. Jane Fletcher had not moved. She stood with both hands gripped around the rail of her porch, her dark hair loose from its braid where the wind had pulled it free, her jaw set so tight he could see the muscle working even from 30 feet away. She was not trembling. He had expected trembling. What he had not expected was the calm ferocity in her eyes, or the way she looked at the man in the center of the three riders as though she had been waiting for this moment and had already decided what it meant. The center rider, a broad man with a gray mustache and a black hat pulled low over pale eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Sheriff Hudson. The name came out like a test, slow and deliberate, measuring the weight of it. "This is not your business. Ride back to town." "I do not ride back to town when I am standing on the road," Robert said. "And right now I am standing on this road. So you can either tell me what brings you to the Fletcher property or you can turn those horses around. I will not ask a third time." The pale-eyed man's gaze shifted past Robert's shoulder toward Jane, and something moved through those eyes, something that was not quite desire and not quite hatred but lived in the dark place where both things meet. "She has something that belongs to my employer," the man said. "We are here to collect it." "She does not appear to be holding it out for you," Robert said. "Not yet." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a thunderstorm, heavy and electric, pressing against the ears. Robert could hear the horses breathing, the soft rhythmic sound of hooves shifting on the packed dirt road, the distant cry of a hawk somewhere above the ridge. He did not take his eyes off the three men. He did not need to look back at Jane to know she was still there. He could feel her presence behind him the way a person feels heat from a banked fire, not seen but absolutely real. This was the moment everything had been building toward, though Robert Hudson had not known it 3 weeks ago when he first rode into Caldwell Junction on a borrowed horse with a star pinned to his chest and secrets of his own that he had never intended to share with anyone, least of all a woman like Jane Fletcher, who saw through things the way morning light cuts through river fog, clearly and without apology. 3 weeks earlier, Caldwell Junction had not been on any map Robert Hudson trusted. He had picked it up from a wanted notice posted in Dodge City, a small settlement in southern Kansas in the year 1882, the kind of town that appeared between two dry riverbeds and survived on cattle drives and stubborn optimism. The United States Marshal's Service had asked him to take the vacancy quietly. The previous sheriff had died of causes that the local doctor called a bad heart, and the local people called something else entirely, in whispers, when they thought no one official was listening. Robert had ridden in on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the cottonwood trees along the creek bed were just beginning to yellow at their edges, and the air held the first thin edge of what would become genuine autumn cold. He was 34 years old, broad through the chest, with dark hair that had started to silver slightly at the temples in the past year, which he found irritating but had no practical means of addressing. He had worked as a deputy in Abilene, a town marshal in a small Colorado settlement, and briefly as a scout for the Army before a disagreement about methods had ended that arrangement. He was not a man who smiled easily or talked more than the situation required, and the people of Caldwell Junction seemed to regard him with the cautious, slightly hopeful wariness of a town that had been disappointed before, and was not yet ready to stop hoping entirely. He met Jane Fletcher on his second day in Caldwell Junction. She had come into the general store on Main Street, which was also the only street that could reasonably be called a street, while he was speaking to the store's proprietor, a nervous man named Aldous Fenn, about the previous sheriff's death. Fenn had been in the middle of explaining that nobody really remembered exactly when Sheriff Dawson had last eaten a full meal or had a full night's sleep, trailing off at irregular intervals in the way of a man trying very hard not to say something specific, when the bell above the door announced her arrival, and both men turned. She was not what Robert had expected when he pictured the women of a small Kansas cattle town. She was dressed practically, in a plain dark skirt and a work-worn cotton blouse, with leather boots that had seen real use, and a sun-browned complexion that came from working outdoors and not from fashion. She was perhaps 28 or 29, he thought, though there was something in her eyes that felt older than that, a quality of watchfulness and assessment that people develop when they have had to rely on their own judgment for a long time. She carried a list in one hand and a small leather purse in the other, and when she saw the badge on his chest she stopped walking and looked at him with those measuring eyes for a moment before she nodded. "You must be the new man," she said. Not unfriendly. Not warm either. "Precise. Robert Hudson," he said. "Sheriff." "Jane Fletcher," she said. "I own the Fletcher Ranch out on the East Road. Your predecessor visited it occasionally." She paused, and the pause was deliberate. On official business. Aldous Fenn suddenly became intensely interested in reorganizing a shelf of canned goods behind the counter. Robert looked at Jane Fletcher for a moment. The dark past that apparently surrounded the dead Sheriff Dawson seemed to be capable of casting a long shadow. "I see," he said. "I will probably have occasion to visit the ranches in the area myself. Introductory calls." "Of course," she said, and turned to Fenn with her list, which was the efficient dismissal of a woman who had things to do and did not intend to perform more social courtesies than the situation required. Robert found himself watching her for a moment longer than was strictly professional, before he returned his attention to the canned goods behind which Aldous Fenn had essentially attempted to disappear. He made his introductory calls over the following week, visiting the 4 ranches that operated within what he considered his jurisdiction. The Hartwell spread to the north, the 2 Delacroix brothers running cattle to the west, the former homestead turned boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Carver in the center of town, and the Fletcher Ranch to the east. He left the Fletcher Ranch for last, not because of any particular strategy, but because the directions Fenn had given him kept becoming complicated in ways he suspected were not accidental. He finally found it on a Thursday afternoon, following the East Road until it curved around a dry wash and then climbed a small ridge, beyond which the land opened up into a broad, well-watered valley fed by a creek that still ran despite the late summer dryness. The ranch itself was modest but clearly maintained with care. A main house of timber and adobe with a wide covered porch, a solid barn, a corral with 4 horses, and a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house that was larger and more productive-looking than any garden he had seen this far into the dry country. Jane Fletcher was in the corral when he arrived, working with a young bay mare that clearly had opinions about being worked with. She was moving slowly around the horse's offside, speaking in a low voice that he could not hear from the gate, and the mare was listening with the alert, uncertain ears of an animal that has not yet decided whether to trust. Robert tied his horse at the gate post and leaned against the fence and watched, not wanting to interrupt what was clearly a delicate negotiation. It took 10 minutes before Jane noticed him. She showed no surprise. She stroked the mare's neck once, said something else to her, and walked to the fence. "Sheriff Hudson," she said. "Introductory call." "If you have time," he said. "I have the time I make," she said, and opened the corral gate. They sat on the porch with coffee she made quickly and well, the dark, strong coffee of someone who took the preparation seriously, and she answered his questions about the ranch and the area with the same precise economy she had shown in the general store. She ran the ranch alone, she told him, with 2 hired hands who came on a seasonal basis, brothers named Cal and Amos Birch, who were good workers and honest men. Her parents had homesteaded this land before Kansas was fully settled, and they had both died within a year of each other when Jane was 22, leaving her the property and the debt, and the work of keeping both in order. That had been 6 years ago. She had kept it in order. He asked, carefully, about Sheriff Dawson's visits. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with those measuring eyes. The afternoon light was long and golden through the porch posts, and it caught the edge of her cheekbone in a way that made something in his chest do something it had not done in a considerable time. Dawson was being paid by a man named Clarence Mott, she said. Mott owns the Mott Cattle Company out of Wichita. He has been trying to acquire the ranches in this valley for 3 years. The Hartwell family sold to him last spring. The Delacroix brothers sold in July. I have not sold. Robert set down his coffee cup. What did Dawson do for Mott? He made things difficult, Jane said. He contested my water rights with the county recorder. He cited my property for violations that did not exist. He lost paperwork that I had filed. She paused. And he came out here twice to tell me personally that continuing to hold out was not wise. Did he threaten you directly? He implied outcomes, she said. He was careful about direct words. Robert looked out across the valley, which was golden and wide and genuinely beautiful in the September light. He could understand why Mott wanted it. He could also understand something about the woman sitting beside him that had to do with the particular quality of a person who does not bend. I will look into Mott, he said. I have been looking into Mott for 3 years, Jane said. What I know would fill a reasonable document. What I can prove in a court of law would fill rather less of one. He left the ranch that afternoon with a head full of information and a different kind of weight than he had carried when he arrived. Something about the situation pressed against the specific texture of his conscience in a way that was not simply professional. He was aware of this and was not entirely comfortable with the awareness. Over the following days he made inquiries. He sent a wire to the county seat at Caldwell proper, and another to the Marshal's service contact in Wichita, and a third, more careful one to an acquaintance in the Pinkerton agency who owed him a favor and had better access to financial records than a county sheriff could ordinarily obtain. What came back over the following week confirmed Jane Fletcher's account in its major points and added several details she may not have known. Clarence Mott was 47 years old, the son of a Kansas City merchant who had expanded aggressively into cattle speculation during the boom years of the late 1870s. He had built the Mott Cattle Company through a combination of legitimate operations and a pattern of acquisition that walked a careful line between aggressive business practice and outright fraud. 3 previous land disputes involving Mott properties had been settled out of court on terms that were never made public. The previous county sheriff who had investigated a water rights dispute involving one of Mott's acquisitions had resigned unexpectedly 2 months into his inquiry. Sheriff Dawson of Caldwell Junction had, prior to his death, received 4 cash deposits totaling $800 through an intermediary in Wichita. The 3 riders who had appeared at Jane Fletcher's gate that afternoon 3 weeks into Robert's tenure were not random. Their leader, the pale-eyed man with the gray mustache, was named Garrett Cole. He had worked for Mott's interests in 3 previous property disputes. He was not a man who used direct violence when intimidation served, but he was also not a man who stopped at intimidation when the situation called for something harder. Robert had learned all of this in pieces over those 3 weeks, and the learning of it had required him to spend time at the Fletcher Ranch that went somewhat beyond what the professional investigation strictly demanded. Jane had a mind that worked quickly and precisely, and without the particular brand of sentimentality that people sometimes applied to difficult situations in order to avoid looking at them clearly. She shared information the way she shared coffee, without ceremony, but with genuine quality. She asked questions that Robert found himself thinking about for hours after he had ridden back to town. On his fourth visit to the ranch, she had shown him the document she had assembled on Mott, a thick sheaf of papers in a calfskin folder containing property records, correspondence, witness statements, and a careful chain of financial inference that traced Mott's payments to Dawson through two intermediaries. It was the work of years, and it was impressive, and it was also, as she had said, not quite enough for a court. "You have been building this alone," he said. "There was no one else to build it," she said. They were sitting at her kitchen table by then, the calfskin folder open between them, and the late afternoon had become early evening without either of them noticing, and the lamp she had lit threw a warm circle of light over the papers and their hands and the table between them. Robert was aware of her proximity in a way that had been building across his previous visits, the particular pull of a person whose presence your body has decided is important before your mind has finished processing the information. He pushed the awareness to the side and focused on the documents, but the awareness did not go away. It had a habit of not going away. On the sixth visit, which was not officially a professional call at all but which he justified to himself as a follow-up on the Mott situation, he arrived to find Jane in the kitchen garden, wrestling with a fence post that had loosened in the recent wind. He got off his horse and helped without being asked, and they worked together in the dusty afternoon heat until the post was set properly in new-tamped earth, and when they straightened up and looked at each other, breathing hard from the effort, with dirt on their hands and the sun full and bright above the valley, something passed between them that neither of them named but both of them felt. "Thank you," she said. Simply, without awkwardness. "You are welcome," he said in the same way. They went inside for coffee, and she asked him something she had not asked before. She asked him where he had come from before Caldwell Junction, and he told her about Abilene and about the small Colorado town and about the Army scouting work, and she listened in the particular focused way she had of listening, which made him feel that what he was saying was being genuinely heard rather than simply waded through. He told her more than he had intended to. He told her about the disagreement with the Army that had ended his scouting work, which had involved a decision to prevent an attack on a Cheyenne encampment that his commanding officer had ordered and that Robert had found unconscionable. He had not talked about that to anyone since it had happened. "That must have cost you something," Jane said. "My position," he said, "and some friendships, and some sleep for a while." "But not the thing you would have had to give up if you had done it differently," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "not that." She looked back at him for a moment with those steady, perceptive eyes, and then she refilled his coffee cup and said, "I think Mott will make a more direct move before the end of October. The cattle sale season ends in November, and he wants this valley in his books before winter." He appreciated the shift back to the practical. He also noticed that he did not want to make the shift back and had to firmly override his own reluctance. He rode back to town that evening in the blue dusk of late September, past the yellowing cottonwoods and the dry creek bed, and he thought about Jane Fletcher with a focus that had nothing to do with the Mott investigation. She was brave in the particular way that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision that certain things matter more than fear. She was honest with a precision that he found, after years of working in places where honesty was a negotiating tool rather than a principle, almost startling. She was alone in a way that she had clearly long ago made her peace with, but that peace, he thought, was the kind that requires constant maintenance and costs something. He returned to the Fletcher ranch on his 8th visit with the intention of telling her that he had received confirmation from his Wichita contact that Garrett Cole had been seen in the area, which was true and which was the professional reason for the visit. He was going to be completely professional. He was going to deliver this information and discuss the implications and ride back to town. He was greeted at the gate by Jane's hired hand, Cal Birch, a quiet young man of about 20 who had the burned, watchful look of someone who had grown up in hard country, who told him that Miss Fletcher was at the creek, checking the water level. He found her sitting on a flat rock above the creek, which still ran clear and shallow in its bed, with her boots off and her bare feet in the water. She was looking out at the valley with an expression on her face that he had not seen before in their dealings, something unguarded, almost melancholy, the face of a person whose practical armor has come off for a private moment. She heard him coming, and by the time he reached the rock the expression had shifted back toward her usual composure, but not entirely. There was still something soft around her eyes. "I heard from Wichita," he said, sitting down on the rock beside her without being invited, which surprised him. "Garrett Cole is in the area. He is Mott's enforcer. I have been told he has done this work 3 times before." She absorbed this with a nod. "I expected something like this. I am going to increase my presence on this road," he said, "daily if I can manage it." She looked at him. "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said. The creek ran softly over its stones. A red-tailed hawk circled in the deep blue above them. Jane's feet were pale and small in the clear water, and Robert Hudson was aware of himself noticing this, and was mildly astonished by the fact that he was the kind of man who noticed things like that. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not challenging. Genuinely wanting to know, he considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because what Mott is doing is wrong," he said, "and because you have been fighting it alone for 3 years, and that is too long for anyone to fight something like this alone." She was quiet for a moment. "That is the professional reason," she said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was on her face, and the unguarded quality was still there, and he thought that she already knew the other answer and was giving him the choice of whether to say it. "Yes," he said. "Robert," she said, which was the first time she had used his first name. "Jane," he said, which was the first time he had used hers. And that was all they said. But the saying of those 2 names in that particular order carried more weight than a great many longer sentences. He rode back to town that evening with a different kind of weight than the one he had carried down to the creek. This one was warmer and more complicated and significantly more alarming from the standpoint of a man who had spent the past several years keeping his personal life carefully uncomplicated. He could not quite work out when it had happened. When Jane Fletcher had moved from the category of a citizen, he was protecting into the category of a person whose safety mattered to him in a way that made it difficult to breathe properly when he thought about Garrett Cole being in the area. He put in a full day at the sheriff's office the next morning, handling a dispute between 2 of the cattle drivers who had been passing through on a late-season drive, and a complaint about a broken fence on the Delacroix property. And all day the knowledge of Garrett Cole's presence sat in the back of his mind like a coal that has not quite caught, but is getting warm. He sent a wire to the Marshal's service in Wichita, requesting backup and authority to act on the financial evidence Jane had assembled. The wire that came back was not encouraging. The case was not yet sufficient for federal intervention. The financial evidence needed corroboration from a source other than the assembled documents. Robert read the wire twice and then folded it very carefully into quarters and put it in his desk drawer, and sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk. He was on his own, and in all likelihood so was Jane. He did not go back to the ranch that day because he had a town to look after and because he was aware, with the particular self-knowledge of a man who has made enough mistakes to learn from them, that his personal feelings and his professional judgment were in danger of becoming tangled in ways that would not serve her well. He spent that evening instead reviewing the documents she had shared with him, looking for something that could substitute for the federal corroboration the Marshal's service had asked for. He found it in the early hours of the morning, a small detail in a property transfer record from 1879 that connected Mott's operating agent in Caldwell Junction to a county land recorder's office transaction that had never been properly witnessed. It was not much, but it was something, a thread that, if pulled carefully, might unravel into something a federal court would find actionable. He was at Jane's gate by 9 o'clock the next morning, which was 3 days before Garrett Cole and his two companions appeared at that same gate, and he laid out what he had found at the kitchen table, and Jane looked at the record for a long, quiet moment. "I saw this," she said. "I did not understand its significance. It may be the corroboration the Marshal's service needs," he said, "if we can get a formal deposition from the land recorder." "The land recorder is a man named Pruitt," Jane said. "He has been in Caldwell Junction for 11 years. He is not a dishonest man. He was, I think, frightened into complicity." "Frightened men sometimes talk when they feel protected," Robert said. Jane looked at him with a complex expression, something that held gratitude and something else, something warmer. "Do you think you can protect him?" "I think we can," Robert said. It was the first time he had said "we" in that context, and the word hung briefly in the air between them. Jane looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Yes, I think we can." He left to speak to Pruitt that afternoon and found him in the land recorder's office, a small dusty room in the back of the courthouse building. A thin, precise man of perhaps 50 who wore a coat regardless of the temperature and who clearly had not had an entirely comfortable night's sleep in several years. Robert showed him the property transfer record and watched Pruitt's face go through several careful arrangements before settling into something that looked like a decision being made. "I was told," Pruitt said carefully, "that this was a standard correction of an administrative error." "Who told you that?" Robert said. "A man from Mott's office in Wichita," Pruitt said. "A man named Harker." "Would you be willing to put that in a signed statement?" Robert said. Pruitt looked at him for a long time. "Would I be protected?" he asked. "I would personally guarantee it," Robert said, which was a significant commitment for a single county sheriff to make. But he made it without hesitation because the alternative was leaving a frightened man without the protection he needed to do the right thing. Pruitt gave his deposition the following morning, which Robert wrote out carefully in triplicate, witnessing all 3 copies with the signatures of 2 local business owners who were willing to serve as witnesses. He sent 1 copy to the Marshal's service in Wichita, retained 1 in the courthouse safe, and gave 1 to Jane, who held it for a moment with both hands as though she was measuring its weight against the 3 years of fighting that had led to its creation. "This might be enough," she said. "It might be," he said, "but it will take time to move through the system, and Mott will hear about Pruitt's deposition before long." Jane looked at him steadily. "Which means Cole will come to the ranch before the federal response comes." "I think so," he said. She nodded. She went back to her kitchen and refilled the coffee. She brought the 2 cups back to the table and set his in front of him, and then she sat down across from him and looked at him with the full, direct regard of a person who has decided something. "I need to say something to you," she said. "All right," he said. "I have been managing this alone for a long time," she said. "And I have become accustomed to managing alone. I am not certain I always make the clearest decisions about when to accept help." He waited. The morning light was clear and white through the window. "I am glad you came to Caldwell Junction," she said. "I am glad it was you." The simple directness of it went through him like a clean note struck on a tuned instrument. He looked at her across the kitchen table with the coffee cups and the papers and the morning light, and he said, "I am glad it was you too. I mean, glad it was this place. Glad it was yours." She smiled. He had not seen her smile fully before, not the small, controlled expressions of professional courtesy, but a real smile, the kind that changes the whole architecture of a face, and it was something he thought he would carry with him for a considerable time. The moment lasted exactly as long as moments like that are allowed to last before the world interrupts them, which is to say it was interrupted by the sound of Cal Birch at the door saying that there were tracks on the East Road that were not regular ranch traffic, fresh tracks of at least 3 horses going slowly, the way men go slowly when they are not sure whether to come to the gate yet. Robert stood up. He put on his hat. He looked at Jane, who had stood up too, and the moment between them shifted from warmth to something else, the particular gravity of 2 people who understand that something difficult is about to happen and have decided together to face it. "Stay on the porch," he said. "I will stay on the porch," she said. "I will not stay out of it." He almost smiled at that. He went out the front door and walked to the gate. The three riders appeared at the end of the road 6 minutes later. He let them come all the way to the gate before he spoke. "Dismount and walk away, or stay and explain yourselves to me." Garrett Cole's pale eyes moved from Robert's badge to his gun hand to his face and back to the badge. He had the calculating stillness of a man running mathematics in his head. "She has something that belongs to my employer," Cole said. "We are here to collect it." "She does not appear to be holding it out for you," Robert said. "Not yet." The second rider, a younger man with a sunburnt neck and the restless hands of someone who defaults to quick action, shifted in his saddle. The third rider was very still, which Robert found more concerning than the restlessness. "What does your employer believe she has?" Robert said. "Documents," Cole said. "Business documents that were improperly obtained from Mott Company operations." Robert kept his voice level. "What is the legal basis for that claim?" "My employer's lawyers have filed a complaint with the county." "No such complaint has been filed with this county," Robert said. "I checked the courthouse records this morning." A brief, very small tightening around Cole's eyes. He had not expected that. "The filing is pending," Cole said. "Then your employer can collect whatever he claims through proper legal channels when the filing is completed and reviewed," Robert said. "Until that time, this is private property, and you are not welcome on it." Cole looked past Robert's shoulder again, that long, calculating look toward the porch where Jane stood. "Miss Fletcher has been making things difficult for a long time," he said. "Mr. Mott is a patient man, but patience has a natural end." "I am going to be very clear with you," Robert said. "I have a deposition, witnessed and filed, connecting Mott's operation to the improper handling of property transfer records in this county. I have that deposition in 3 copies, one of which is already in the hands of the United States Marshals Service in Wichita. If anything happens to this property or to the woman who owns it, there is nothing that will prevent a federal investigation from reaching Mott's door. You should tell him that." The silence that followed was longer this time. Robert could see Cole processing the information, measuring its weight, calculating the altered mathematics of the situation. The restless young rider had gone still. The very still rider in the back had, Robert thought, become fractionally less certain. "You are playing a dangerous game, Sheriff," Cole said finally. "I am enforcing the law on a public road," Robert said. "Dismount and walk away, or stay and explain yourselves to me. I have told you what I know. I have told you what will happen. Your choices have been clearly laid out. This is the last time I will explain them." Cole looked at him for another long moment. Then he looked at the ranch, at the porch, at Jane, who was standing absolutely still with her hands on the rail, her chin level, her eyes unflinching. Something moved across Cole's face, a calculation completed, a risk reevaluated. He pulled his horse's head around. "We will be back," he said. "If you come back without legal authority for your presence," Robert said, "I will arrest you for trespassing and harassment of a property owner. Good afternoon." Cole rode away without another word. The restless rider followed. The still one lingered for exactly 3 seconds longer, which Robert counted, before turning and following the others. Robert stood at the gate until the 3 riders were past the bend in the road and their dust had thinned to nothing. Then he turned and walked back to the porch. Jane was watching him come. Her hands had released the rail. There was color in her face that had not been there before, high in her cheeks, and her eyes were very bright. "You told them about the deposition," she said. "Yes. That reveals our hand. It changes Mott's calculation," he said. "Moving against you now would bring federal scrutiny he cannot afford, not with the deposition already in Wichita. He is a businessman. He will want to find another way." She looked at him for a moment. "You took a risk." "I made a judgment," he said. "There is a difference." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Come inside. The coffee will be cold, but I will make more." He followed her inside. He stayed for dinner, which was the first time he had stayed for dinner, and Jane cooked with the same efficient competence she brought to everything. A simple meal of salt beef and potatoes and the last of the kitchen garden's beans. And they ate at the kitchen table in the lamp light and talked about things that were not mott or coal or deposition documents, about the valley in different seasons, about the horses, about books. Because it turned out that Jane Fletcher had a shelf of books that surprised him with its breadth, Dickens and Cooper, and a scientific text on geology she had ordered from a publisher in St. Louis because she had wanted to understand the rock formation in the ridge above the valley. "You are a great deal more interesting than I expected," he said, and then felt the bluntness of it and thought he ought to qualify it. "You expected something narrow," she said, without offense. "I expected someone who had been through what you have been through and had been made smaller by it," he said. She considered this. "It very nearly did make me smaller," she said. "For a time, after my parents died and I understood the full weight of what I was holding alone, I was frightened in a way that I think could have gone either direction, toward closing off or toward opening out." "What decided it?" said. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things. "A mare," she said. "The one you saw me working with in the corral on your first visit. She came to me half broken by someone who did not know how to work with a horse properly, full of hidden motives and fear, and every day working with her I had to decide whether to meet that fear with control or with patience. The patience was harder and slower, and it worked." She paused. "I decided to try applying that to the rest of my life as well." He looked at her across the table in the lamp light. "That is a better philosophy than most I have encountered," he said. "It has occasional holes," she said. "I have not, for example, figured out how to be patient about Clarence Mott." He smiled. She caught it, and something in her face shifted with a warmth that he felt across the table as clearly as if she had reached across it. They were quiet for a moment. Outside, the night was settling over the valley with the deep, peaceful silence of open country, and the lamp made its warm circle around the two of them at the table, and Robert Hudson was aware that he did not want to ride back to town. "I should go," he said. "You should probably stay," she said. "Cole and his men may be on the East Road." It was a practical statement, and also, he thought, something more than a practical statement. He looked at her and she met his eyes steadily. "The guest room," she said. "It is perfectly straightforward." "Yes," he said. "Thank you." He slept in the guest room, which was small and clean, with a window that looked out on the dark valley and the stars above the ridge. He lay awake for a while listening to the silence and thinking about Jane Fletcher with the particular focused helplessness of a man who has accepted that something important has happened to him and has not yet determined what to do about it. In the morning, he rose before dawn and went out to check the road and found no sign of Cole's horses returning. When he came back inside, Jane was already in the kitchen making coffee and breakfast, and the domestic ordinariness of the scene did something to the inside of his chest that he could not precisely name, but did not attempt to fight. They ate breakfast together in the morning light, and he helped her with the horses afterward, and the ease of working beside her had the particular quality of something that has always been this way, which was impossible since they had known each other for less than 3 weeks, but which was nonetheless unmistakably the case. He went back to town mid-morning and found a wire waiting for him from the marshal's service in Wichita. The deposition, combined with the financial evidence Jane had assembled, and a separate investigation the marshal's service had been running into Mott's operations in another county, was sufficient to justify a federal inquiry. 2 deputy marshals would arrive in Caldwell Junction within the week. Until then, Robert was requested to maintain the situation and to protect the principal witness. He read the wire 3 times, and then he put on his hat and rode back to the Fletcher ranch. Jane was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, tending the last of the season's tomatoes with the focused attention she gave to all living things. She looked up when she heard him and read something in his face before he spoke. "Good news," she said. "Federal marshals in a week," he said. "You are the principal witness." She straightened up from the garden and looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the 3 years of fighting in her eyes and the weight of it, and beneath that weight the very first signs of something beginning to lift. "A week," she said. "A week," he said. "I will be here." She looked at him. "You have been here," she said. "I will continue to be here," he said. The quiet between them held something that had been building across all the visits and the coffees and the documents and the working side by side, and he thought he should say something specific about it, something clear and honest, the way she was always clear and honest, and so he said it. "I am aware that the timing of this is irregular," he said, "and that my position here creates a complexity. But I want you to know that what I feel about this situation is not separable from what I feel about you, and I did not intend for that to be the case, but it is, and I think you should know it." She looked at him with those measuring eyes for a moment, and then she said, "I have known it for some time." "And," he said, "and I feel the same way," she said, "with the same complexity and the same lack of intent." He crossed the kitchen garden in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he held her face in both his hands and looked at her for a moment before he kissed her, which was gentle and then not gentle, and her hands were on his arms, and the garden was warm and dusty around them, and the valley was wide and open beyond the fence. When they parted, she was looking up at him with color in her face and brightness in her eyes and that real smile, the one that changed everything. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "That was overdue," she said. He laughed, which surprised both of them because it was a genuine laugh, unguarded and easy, and she laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the valley in the warm autumn morning. They went inside and had coffee, and he stayed the rest of the day because there was professional justification, and also because neither of them wanted him to leave. The week before the federal marshals arrived was not without incident. On the second day, Cal Birch rode in to report that 2 men he did not recognize had been watching the ranch from the ridge above the valley, moving off when he rode toward them. Robert spent a full day on patrol around the property's perimeter, methodical and unhurried, making his presence visible on every road that led to the ranch. He also had a conversation with Cole's young restless rider, who turned out to be named Webb, and who Robert found drinking alone at the saloon on Main Street on the 3rd evening. A young man of perhaps 23 who had the particular expression of someone who has begun to question the choices that brought him to his current situation. Robert sat down across from Webb and bought him a second whiskey and talked to him not as a sheriff to a man under investigation, but as one person to another, about the specifics of what Cole had done and what Mott was doing, and what the federal inquiry was going to look like. Webb listened. Robert did not offer him anything specific, but he made it clear that the difference between a man who was present at intimidation activities and a man who provided cooperative testimony about those activities was a difference that federal prosecutors were generally inclined to recognize. Webb said nothing that evening. But on the 4th morning, he appeared at the sheriff's office and asked to speak to Robert privately, and what he said over the next 2 hours was the most complete account of Garrett Cole's activities in the Caldwell Junction area that Robert had yet obtained, including specifics about Cole's earlier visit to Dawson's office, about the payments Cole had been authorized to make, and about the broader scope of Mott's intentions for the valley, which went beyond the Fletcher Ranch to include a planned diversion of the creek itself to serve a larger cattle operation Mott had been planning for the past year. Robert took the statement carefully and fully, witnessing it and having it co-signed by the deputy he had sworn in the previous week, a reliable local man named Hector Vance. He sent a copy to the marshal's service immediately and kept the original in the courthouse safe. He rode to the ranch that afternoon and told Jane everything, including the creek diversion plan, which she received with a controlled fury that he found both entirely understandable and rather magnificent. The creek was the reason the valley was productive. The creek was what had drawn her parents to homestead here in the first place. The creek was, in a very real sense, the valley's life. He was going to drain it, she said. Redirect it to his main operation, Robert said. Webb says the engineering assessment was completed 6 months ago. Jane was quiet for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the creek visible in the middle distance, running clear and steady through the valley floor. Then she looked at Robert and said, He was never going to stop at documents. The documents were always secondary. He needed the land because of the water. Yes, Robert said. Which means this was always going to come to a confrontation, she said. Yes, he said. And you put yourself between that confrontation and me, she said. I did, he said. She looked at him with an expression that moved between fierce gratitude and something even more personal, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his. The touch was deliberate and warm. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while, with the creek visible through the window and the valley around them, and the knowledge of what they had built together in 3 weeks and what was about to be resolved. The 2 deputy United States Marshals arrived in Caldwell Junction on the 7th day from the wire, a Thursday morning in mid-October, when the cottonwoods along the creek were fully gold, and the air held the clean, sharp bite of genuine autumn. Their names were Hartley and Crane, both capable-looking men of middle age who reviewed Robert's documentation with the focused efficiency of people who know what they are looking at. This is solid, Hartley said after an hour with the papers. The Mott operation has been on our board for 2 years. This connects it to this county in a way we can act on. Miss Fletcher assembled the core of it, Robert said. 3 years of work. Hartley looked at him. We will need her testimony. She is ready to give it, Robert said. He rode out to the ranch with both marshals and watched Jane present her evidence and testimony with the same precise, unflinching clarity she brought to everything. And he watched Hartley and Crane's expressions shift from professional assessment to something more like impressed recognition, as the full scope of what she had built became clear. They were with her for 4 hours. When they left, they took copies of everything and left their federal authority clearly established over the investigation. Cole and his men were found and arrested at a boarding house in the next town east 2 days later. The arrest was clean and without incident. Webb's testimony had given the marshals enough to hold Cole on charges that would survive the initial hearing. The wire to Clarence Mott's office in Wichita, informing him of the federal inquiry and the specific charges being developed, went out that same day. Mott's response, which came back through his lawyers, was a blizzard of legal objections and counterfilings that Marshals Hartley and Crane handled with the slightly weary efficiency of professionals who have seen this response before. It took another 6 weeks for the situation to resolve fully through the federal court process. 6 weeks during which Robert Hudson spent the better part of his evenings at the Fletcher Ranch, and the days managing the steady work of keeping Caldwell Junction running. And the two of them moved through those 6 weeks with the particular ease of 2 people who have established something real, and are not yet ready to put a formal name to it, but are fully aware of its weight and its permanence. He helped her bring in the last of the kitchen garden before the first frost. He was present the afternoon she finally achieved the full trust of the bay mare, watching from the fence as horse and rider moved together with the fluid understanding that is the result of genuine patience and genuine respect, and something in his chest felt the specific warmth of witnessing something that is exactly what it should be. She came to him in town once when he had been working through the night on a legal dispute between 2 ranchers, and arrived at the sheriff's office at 7 in the morning with a basket containing breakfast and a look on her face that said both, "I know you have not slept, and you should eat this," in exactly the same glance. He kissed her in the doorway of the sheriff's office at 7 in the morning, with the smell of fresh biscuits between them and the early autumn light on the street of Caldwell Junction. And Aldous Fenn, who happened to be opening his store across the way, turned back to his door with the particular studied inattention of a man who is very deliberately not looking at something. On a Tuesday evening in late October, sitting on the porch of the ranch as the sun went down over the ridge and turned the valley gold and then amber, and then the deep blue of early dusk, Robert said, "I have been thinking about something I want to ask you." Jane was sitting beside him in the second porch chair, which had materialized on the porch at some point during the past weeks in a way that neither of them had specifically arranged, but that both of them had simply accepted as correct. She was holding her coffee cup and looking at the valley, and when he spoke she turned to look at him with that steady, perceptive attention. "I have been thinking about it for several weeks," he said. "I have been trying to determine the right moment, which I think I have been using as an excuse for the fact that I am uncertain of the answer, which is unusual for me because I am generally fairly clear about things." "You are stalling," Jane said. "I am," he agreed. "I am asking you to marry me." She looked at him. The valley was going blue around them and the first stars were appearing above the ridge, and she looked at him with those eyes that saw things clearly. "I know what this is," she said. "I know what you are and I know what you are to me. I am not uncertain about it." "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," she said. He took her hand. She leaned against his shoulder. The dusk settled over the valley, and the stars came out one by one above the ridge, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying. The federal case against Clarence Mott was formally opened in November 1882. The charges included fraudulent manipulation of land transfer records, criminal conspiracy to interfere with property rights, and the improper procurement of official cooperation through payment, the last charge applying specifically to the payments made to the late Sheriff Dawson. Mott's lawyers fought the proceedings with everything they had, but the documentation Jane had assembled, combined with Webb's testimony and Prewitt's deposition, proved to be exactly what the federal prosecutors needed. It would take until the following spring for the case to be fully adjudicated, but the outcome, once the marshals had the full evidentiary package, was not seriously in doubt. Clarence Mott was ordered to pay a substantial financial penalty and was barred from property acquisitions in southern Kansas. The land transfers that had already taken place, including the Hartwell and Delacroix properties, were subject to a separate review that ultimately resulted in a renegotiated purchase arrangement more favorable to the original sellers. Garrett Cole received 18 months at the federal prison in Leavenworth, which Robert considered insufficient, but which was what the evidence supported on the specific charges. Webb, who had cooperated fully, was not charged in connection with the intimidation activities, but was strongly advised to choose his future employers more carefully, advice he appeared to take to heart. He left the area and was not heard from again. Prewitt, the land recorder, received a formal commendation from the county and the modest satisfaction of having done the right thing, which he seemed to find genuinely sustaining. He also received, the following year, a promotion to a more senior position in the county records office, which Robert thought was justice of a particularly appropriate kind. Robert and Jane were married in December 1882 at the Caldwell Junction Church, which was a small white-painted building on the far end of Main Street that doubled as a town meeting hall and occasional school on days when the circuit preacher was not present. He was not present on a great many days, but he was present on the second Saturday of December, a cold, clear morning when the valley was laced with frost, and the sky was the particular hard blue of winter. Jane wore a dark blue dress she had ordered from a dressmaker in Wichita, which arrived exactly 3 days before the wedding, and which she opened with the same no-ceremony practicality she applied to everything, examining it for quality and fit before she set it aside with the small expression that he had come to recognize as her version of pleased. Aldous Fenn attended. Cal and Amos Birch attended, the Birch brothers standing in their good clothes with the slightly bewildered decency of young men who are genuinely glad for someone else's happiness. Prewitt attended. Marshals Hartley and Crane had returned to Wichita, but sent a formal letter of congratulation that arrived the same day as the dress. The ceremony was short, and the words were the old words, the ones that had been said by generations of people who intended them, and Robert held Jane's hands at the front of the small church and looked at her, and heard himself saying the words clearly, and felt that he had not said them better or more completely in his life. In the spring of 1883, Jane discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Robert on a March morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt from the ridge, and the valley was beginning to go green at its edges, sitting at the kitchen table with the morning light on her face. And she watched him take the news in with the particular intensity of a man who is feeling something very large and does not have immediate words for it. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her and held her for a long time, his face against her hair, and she held him back with the quiet sureness of someone who knows that this is exactly right. "A boy or a girl," he said eventually. "Either would be fine," she said. "Either would be remarkable," he said. "Given who their mother is." She pulled back far enough to look at him with those eyes and that real smile, the one that had changed him from the first time he had seen it fully. "Given who their father is," she said. "Their son was born in October 1883, a full year after the confrontation at the gate that had set everything in motion. They named him Thomas James Hudson, Thomas for Jane's father and James for Robert's brother, who had died years before in circumstances that Robert had never spoken of in detail, but which Jane knew had been formative in ways that went deep. Thomas arrived in the world with a full set of opinions about the matter and communicated them clearly and at volume, which Robert found reassuring in a way that amused Jane considerably. Thomas James Hudson grew into a cheerful, relentlessly curious boy who was his mother's shadow in the garden, and the barn and his father's shadow at every opportunity, which sometimes created a logistical challenge, but which was more than compensated for by the sight of the two of them together, the broad-shouldered man and the small, dark-haired boy walking the valley or checking the horses or sitting on the porch in the evening. The ranch prospered. With the Mott threat resolved, the valley was free from the pressure that had constrained Jane's operations for 3 years, and she expanded the kitchen garden into a proper market garden that supplied not only the ranch's needs, but also the general store in Caldwell Junction, and occasionally the next town east. She also began working more formally with horses, the careful, patient training that she had described to Robert the first evening at the kitchen table, and her reputation for producing reliable, well-trained animals spread through the county in the way that genuine quality always spreads. Robert continued as sheriff of Caldwell Junction, which suited him in a way that surprised him. He had always thought of his profession as something that moved him forward, from one place to the next, never quite settling. What he found in Caldwell Junction was that settling was not a diminishment but a deepening, that knowing a place and its people across years built a kind of understanding that was more useful and more satisfying than the restless movement he had practiced before. He became a fixture of the town in the way of someone who is genuinely known and genuinely trusts in return. The injustice he had witnessed in his earlier years, the dispossession of the Cheyenne that had ended his army work, the fraudulent maneuvering of men like Mott, the easy corruption of men like Dawson, these things did not leave him or become acceptable. What changed was that he had a place from which to work against them, a specific jurisdiction, a specific community, a specific standing in that community that gave him a kind of authority that could be applied to genuine purpose. He was not naive about the limitations of his particular corner of the law in the larger picture. He knew that the forces that had driven Mott's operation were larger than any one case, that the expanding cattle industry and the land pressures that came with it were producing this kind of conflict across the territory and would continue to do so. He did what he could with what he had. He thought that was probably the definition of a life honestly lived. On Thomas's second birthday, Jane was expecting their second child, and this one arrived in the spring, a girl they named Margaret after Jane's mother, and Margaret arrived in the world with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a temperament that suggested very early that she intended to be entirely herself and would not be easily talked out of any position she had taken. Robert looked at her the first time and felt the same large, wordless thing he had felt with Thomas and said, "She is going to be a great deal of work." "She is going to be wonderful," Jane said. "Both things," Robert said. "Both things turned out to be true." The bay mare that Jane had trained in the corral on the morning Robert first came to the ranch lived long and well, and became the foundation of Jane's breeding program, producing several excellent foals over the years, each one trained with the same patient, respectful method that had rescued the mare from her earlier experience. Jane's way with horses became something people traveled distances to observe and to discuss, and she taught others, occasionally and selectively, with the practical unsentimental generosity of someone who has useful knowledge and sees no reason to hoard it. Cal Birch stayed on the ranch for another 3 years before he left to establish his own homestead to the north. He kept in touch and visited regularly, and Robert eventually officiated at Cal's own wedding, which was a role he had not anticipated taking on but which he filled with the quiet, unceremonious sincerity that characterized everything he did. Aldous Fenn expanded his general store in 1885 and became something like a central social institution of Caldwell Junction, the place where information was exchanged, and where the particular social fabric of the town was regularly repaired. He remained slightly nervous as a constitutional matter but was, Robert thought, one of the more decent people he had encountered in his professional life. In the autumn of 1886, when Thomas was 3 and Margaret was 2, and the valley was at its richest with the late harvest, Jane and Robert sat on the porch one evening in the blue dusk, which had become their habitual evening, watching the light go out of the sky above the ridge. The children were inside with the lamp, Thomas arranging rocks he had collected from the creek bed into patterns on the kitchen table, and Margaret watching him with the alert, plodding expression she applied to most of her brother's activities. 4 years, Jane said. Since Cole came to the gate, Robert said. Since you came to the gate, she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the valley with the expression she sometimes had in quiet moments, the one that was not quite melancholy but that held something deep and still, the trace of all the years before he had come, the years of fighting alone, shaped into something she had made her peace with and then found was no longer the whole of her story. I meant what I said, he said. That morning at the creek, I did not want you to fight it alone. She turned to look at him. The porch light caught her face, and she was 34 now, and the years since then had given her face something that his face had always had, a quality of someone who has decided what matters and arranged their life accordingly, and it was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. You never have let me, she said. I never will, he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the settling dusk, with the valley quiet around them, and the lamp light warm in the kitchen window, and the sound of Thomas's rocks clicking together on the table, and Margaret's commentary on the proceedings drifting out through the open door. The creek ran in its bed below the valley floor, unchanged, unredirected, the same cold, clear water that had drawn her parents to this place, and that had been the secret heart of everything Mott had tried and failed to take. It would run through this valley long after all of them were gone, through the grass and the cottonwoods and the land that Jane Fletcher had refused to surrender, and that was now, by every right of law and love and labor, exactly what it had always been meant to be. Hers. Theirs. Robert Hudson, former Army scout, former deputy, sheriff of Caldwell Junction, Kansas, held his wife against his side in the October dusk and thought about the particular way that a life can change completely between the moment you ride into a town and the moment you understand that you have been riding toward it all along. He had not known her name 3 weeks before he stood at that gate with his hand on his gun and his badge in the sun. He had not known that she was there, fighting alone with her documents and her patience and her unbendable conviction about what was worth holding on to. He had not known that the gruff and uneasy economy of his own manner, which had always seemed to him like a limitation, would turn out to be something she found precisely legible, that she would understand him in the direct, unsentimental way she understood the mare and the creek and the valley, not despite her clear eyes but because of them. He had not known any of it. And then he had gone to the gate and said his piece, and she had stood on the porch and not moved, and 3 riders had turned away, and here they were 4 years later in the gathering dark with the lamp in the window. "What are you thinking about?" Jane said. "The gate," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dismount and walk away, or stay and explain yourselves." "They walked away," he said. "You stayed," she said. "I had better reasons to stay," he said. She tilted her head to look up at him with that smile, the real one, the one that had started everything. "You did," she said. "You really did." In the kitchen, Thomas's rocks had apparently achieved the pattern he intended, because his voice rose in small triumph, and a moment later Margaret's voice rose in response, not celebrating but proposing an improvement, which was Margaret's way. Robert and Jane both heard it and both smiled, the kind of mutual smile that carries a full conversation in it without needing words. They sat together on the porch until the dusk was full dark and the stars were out above the ridge, and the valley was silent and safe around them. And the lamp in the kitchen window was the warm center of everything they had made, and neither of them went inside until the children came looking for them, Thomas finding his father's knee and Margaret finding her mother's arms with the instinctive precision of children who know exactly where safety lives. Inside, around the kitchen table in the lamplight, the Hudson family of Caldwell Junction, Kansas, settled into their evening, and the valley held them, and the creek ran, and the stars wheeled above the ridge in their old unchanging courses, and the gate stood open at the end of the road, welcoming, as it had always been meant to do, the people who came with honest purpose and stayed with their whole hearts. The story of how a gruff sheriff told 3 riders to dismount or explain themselves, and in doing so stepped between a woman's life and the forces that had been trying to unmake it, became in time the kind of story that Caldwell Junction told about itself, the kind that accumulates small details and additional flourishes as it moves from person to person, until the details are more legend than record and the truth at the center of it. Which was simply that 2 people had found each other at a gate on a dusty road in the autumn of 1882, and had chosen, both of them, to stay, became the permanent, luminous, absolutely certain thing it was always going to be. Robert and Jane grew old together in that valley, watching the seasons turn through the window above the kitchen table where they had first spread the documents and begun the work of understanding each other. Watching Thomas grow into a quiet, capable young man with his mother's precision and his father's steadiness. Watching Margaret grow into exactly the person she had promised from her first hours to be, magnificent and difficult, and genuinely her own. They added a 3rd child in the late 1880s, a boy they named Henry, who arrived with an ease and cheerfulness that delighted everyone and who grew up the sunniest member of a family that was, at its foundation, built on the particular warm bedrock of 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and chosen each other without reservation. And every October, when the cottonwoods went gold along the creek, and the valley filled with the particular amber light of Kansas autumn, Jane would sometimes stand at the gate in the evening and look down the east road, and Robert would come and stand beside her, and they would both remember, without needing to say it, the day when 3 riders had come down that road with hidden motives and dark intentions, and a man with a badge had planted himself between them and the woman he did not yet know he loved, and made the only reasonable choice available, which was to stay. The valley held all of it, the secrets and the stakes, the betrayal and the courage, the documents and the depositions, the cold creek and the warm lamp, the gate and the road and the 2 people standing at them, choosing every day in all the ways that mattered to stay.